Hello everyone, today we're going to be analyzing Volume 2 of Ultra Heaven. As with Volume 1, the analysis will be done by looking at each page, each panel, and trying to figure out what exactly is happening. I do apologize if I miss anything. Let's begin. Okay, so a little recap. Back in Volume 1, we're introduced to Kabu in the first half, and in the second half, we experience his drug trip with Ultra Heaven. The trip ends with Kabu in a lake and Mr. Walleye laughing at him. This is where we start off in the second volume. So, they're sitting on the bank talking about what Kabu was doing in the real world during his trip. Mr. Walleye says that he circled the lake halfway through and swam across it. And right away, I want to highlight a few things. One is the fact that Kabu's drug trip only begins when he is swimming across the lake, when he's in the water. In the first volume, we can see that while he was circling around the lake, nothing much happens, right? Just some small hallucinations. And then, as he reaches the other side of the lake, suddenly he's behind Sally, holding onto a tree. We don't get to see it directly, but I think that is when the trip is happening. I think that is when he begins to swim, right as he's teleported behind Sally. This means that the whole drug trip is happening while Kabu is in the lake, swimming, which is in line with the three meanings of the water symbolism that were proposed. One, that it represents the passageway or border between two realms of consciousness. Two, it represents purity or rebirth, washing away the filth in the mind like a baptism. And three is that it represents the collective sea of consciousness of the universe itself. This is why we see Kabu getting submerged in water during his trip. He's tapping into that universal consciousness. Now, the second thing I want to highlight, which is kind of a reach to be honest, is the fact that Kabu circled the lake halfway and swam across the middle, back to the beginning. And I want to emphasize the route that he took, the semicircle. I think this is supposed to represent Kabu circumventing the circle of life, creating a half circle of life. Kabu stopping halfway and going back to the beginning of life means that Kabu just skips death. He goes straight to rebirth, just like in his trip. Moving on, Kabu starts complaining to Mr. Walleye about the drug. He says that this isn't pee, Shazadagana. And Mr. Walleye then says that Kabu has good affinity with the drug. Kabu, remembering what Mr. Walleye said in the drug trip, says to him that he called the drug Ultra Heaven only to be laughed at, as Walleye tells him that he's never said that before. Now, does this mean the theory about Mr. Walleye entering Kabu's trip is wrong? I'd say it is, because I overlooked one important detail, which is that Mr. Walleye is not even wearing an amplifier like when he was with the hippie. So, yeah, I was wrong. Continuing the conversation, Mr. Walleye explains that the effects of Ultra Heaven depends on the user, that it doesn't show you hallucinations, it only flips the switch and lets the brain do the rest. This is the exact same thing that he says in the Ultra Heaven trip, on the bridge, which implies that Kabu's hallucinations can show the future. And as a reminder, there have been multiple moments where this does happen, when Kabu kind of predicts the future, such as on the park bench when Kabu predicts exactly what Mr. Walleye is going to say, and it will continue to happen throughout the second volume. This is in line with the theory that there are three realities. Reality 1 is the flashback, which is where we are right now. Reality 2 is the trip that Kabu has after taking Ultra Heaven, or when he's wearing the amp. Reality 3 is the true reality, where he is locked up in the hygiene department, experiencing a flashback. And because Kabu is in a flashback, it makes sense that he can see the future of that flashback, with the help of the drug that shows your inner self, since the inner self is actually in the future. Does that make any sense? I hope that makes sense. So the conversation between the two ends with a lot of interesting points. 1. Kabu has the aura of a diseased man. 2. The concept that everyone has an emptiness, a gaping hole inside of them that they fill with dreams, but for Kabu, there is a wormhole, a crack in space and time. And 3, Mr. Walleye says that Kabu is chickening out. 4, sick people need to make sure of their own sickness. 5, Kabu is cold, sick, and shivering. He's drenched. And 6, Mr. Walleye waiting on a bridge. Okay, let's start with Kabu having a diseased man's aura. From volume 1, we know that Kabu's aura is supposed to be bright and gleaming, more intense than everyone else's. And in that one scene in the apartment, Sally told Kabu that she felt that there was something wrong, and it was as if he was going to go somewhere far, far away. I think this means that Kabu is currently on a higher level of being shown by his aura, and that feeling of something being wrong is Sally fearing Kabu's potential to ascend, to be on that higher realm. She feels sad that Kabu's gonna leave her and uneasy about the idea of ascension. So then what exactly is the reason for Kabu's higher state of being? That's where the second point comes in, that everyone has an emptiness that they fill with dreams, but for Kabu, it's a wormhole. What is this emptiness? I think it's supposed to show the true nature of life, that life is meaningless, empty, there's no inherent purpose to it. Also, if you want to take a Buddhist approach, it's the realization that life is suffering and that reality is an illusion. Now, this is obviously a oversimplification. I'm not going to go into detail with the Buddhist ideas. But back to the emptiness. It's the meaninglessness of life, right, that pervades everyone's being. Normal people don't even have this realization as they fill it up with their dreams, be it a job, a family, a craft, you can even say a religion. It's the thing that keeps everyone busy, that distracts them from realizing the true nature of life. For Kabu, it's a wormhole, meaning that emptiness in his life can never be filled with any dream, any job, because he realizes that all of that is meaningless. You want to put something in a wormhole, it's just going to get transported a million light years away. The hole's always going to be empty. Or is it? As we can see in the first volume, Kabu has doubts on his nihilistic philosophy. It starts with him in the pump bar taking the Nova Express, which is like a mini version of Ultra Heaven. It makes him think, why am I doing all these drugs anyway? And then, in his apartment, he realizes that there are people who care about his well-being. Seven and the bartender in particular. Actually, the bartender set him up with the agent, so, it's fake. But it's still true in Kabu's eyes. So this little tinge of human connection that Kabu felt put a little seed of doubt inside of him. But then he takes Ultra Heaven, which literally puts Kabu into his own mind as he is forced to look at why he thinks this way. You get the scene with the cops, his subconscious tapping in, and then he gets a glimpse of the future where he's locked up in the hygiene department. So then he's like, what the hell's really happening? He's put into this extreme state of confusion. He doesn't even think reality is real anymore. That's why he hugs Sally so tightly later on, because he really wants to make sure that this isn't a dream. And this state of confusion, disarray, makes him feel afraid. He's having an existential crisis. And that is where the third point comes in. Mr. Walleye tells Kabu that he's chickening out. He's afraid of confronting the truth to life, to reality, to who he is as a person. Kabu doesn't want to take more Ultra Heaven, right? It's too much. He just wants to stay comfortable, take some pee, keep living in this illusion. But here's the thing, he can't run away from it. Sick people need to make sure of their own sickness. Deep down, Kabu wants to know the truth to life, to who he is. Of course, that's human nature. Of course we want to know who we are. And that is the fourth point, right? The fifth point of Kabu being cold, sick, and shivering also has to do with the fear he has after taking Ultra Heaven. he's shook. He's shaken to the core. I mean, literally. And again, swimming across the lake is a metaphor for taking Ultra Heaven for the drug trip. So the fact that he's drenched, cold, sick, and shivering, it shows the effect that Ultra Heaven has on Kabu. He just got baptized. It's almost like his nihilistic philosophy is washed away and injected with doubt. And now he is reborn. Finally, the sixth point of Mr. Walleye waiting on a bridge, just like in Kabu's trip. I think it's supposed to represent a path to the truth. He is the bridge between the normal, junky life that Kabu's used to and the truth of Kabu's being, Not really sure about this one though. Maybe Mr. KOIKE is setting up the fourth volume or the third volume, and he never really ended up using it. Not really sure. Anyway. Last thing I want to add is how this dynamic between Kabu, the truth, and Mr. Walleye parallels the classical junkie mentality. That feeling of wanting to know more, of not being able to help yourself, and the fact that the drug dealer, Mr. Walleye, knows that Kabu will, quote, be back for more. Ultra Heaven draws a parallel between the behavior of drug junkies and the people who are obsessed with the truth, be it religious fanatics, cult followers, or just an ordinary guy having an existential crisis. Alright, let's finally move on. After Mr. Walleye leaves, Kabu walks through the forest, drenched and trembling until he arrives at the tree. He leans on the tree and sees another him lying on the ground. He then sees Sally right in front of him on a bench. Kabu realizes that this is a flashback, as everything that happens here has already happened in Volume 1, like the hallucination. And as Sally approaches Kabu, Kabu's mind starts to break down and we see the bubbles. We get a glimpse of the future, where Kabu is in the hygiene department. The thing to note here is that when Kabu realizes that he's currently in a flashback, or when he's going deep in his own mind, as we'll see later, the bubbles appear and a hallucination starts. It's like every time the bubbles appear, it's like the deepest part of Kabu's mind, his subconscious. Now for this scene in particular, Kabu is flatlining and the hygiene department guys are trying to save him. One of them tries to talk to Kabu, asking him if he understands, does he know where he is, and then we see a speech bubble that says, "What is this place? Who am I?" This is probably Kabu's own subconscious talking. You also get Sally asking what's wrong. Now, the questions here are just repeating the points before. They are questions that Kabu is asking to himself. The last thing here is Mr. Walleye saying that this is paradise. This is a callback to what Mr. Walleye said in the drug trip, that a dream more real than reality is paradise. Kabu thinks of this because he realizes that he is in that paradise. He is in that dream that's more real than reality. But that's the problem. It's not a good dream, it's a nightmare. But that'll change by the end of this volume. The mini hallucination ends with Sally talking to Kabu, asking him what happened. Then Kabu suddenly jumps up and hugs Sally tightly. After a short pause, Sally slaps him away and we see this nice little panel where a single drop of water is captioned with, "It's not a dream." The reason Kabu hugs Sally is because he wants to make sure that this is real, and that little droplet of water, again, symbolizes Kabu in the universal sea of consciousness. We then transition into a blurred image of Kabu's face, literally on that sea of consciousness. And turns out he was in this washing machine thing. Actually, it's a really cool concept. Probably one of the coolest futuristic tech I've ever seen in a manga. Now, what I think this scene represents is Kabu being washed and engulfed by the sea of consciousness, which is again represented by the water, just like the lake, the river in the mountains, or the toilet in the pump bar in the beginning of Volume 1. Then we see Sally looking at the food supply in Kabu's kitchen. and it's only filled with instant noodles and spaghetti. I think. I can't read the Japanese labels. And then in the next page, we see that same spaghetti being cooked, juxtaposed with the water coming out the shower. The water looks like spaghetti. This foreshadows the scene later on when Kabu's mom is cooking spaghetti. We're not going to talk about that yet. The important thing to note here is that the spaghetti represents Kabu's past with his mother. The fact that he has so much spaghetti in his kitchen shows that subconsciously Kabu is still tied down to his past, his origin, whether he realizes it or not. Then Kabu showering in that spaghetti, figuratively, I think shows that by entering that universal sea of consciousness, he is brought back to his past. He starts to remember it and he is submerged by it. Now, why though? Why does Kabu remember his past? Because to truly ascend, to fill up that wormhole inside of him, he has to look at himself, understand who he is and where he comes from. And how do you do that? By confronting your past. There are also Buddhist or Zen undertones to this in relation to karma, or any Eastern philosophy in general, that when you die, you revisit your karma. And I'll talk about that in the end, or maybe in another video, who knows. Anyway, we then transition from Kabu being submerged in the water to the kitchen. Kabu is eating with Sally. So Sally starts off by asking Kabu what drug he took. Kabu says it's just a flashback. Sally asks, since when do flashbacks make it rain? Turns out when Kabu was on the tree, he was talking about rain, storm, and a deluge with lightning. I think the manga is trying to tell us that to Kabu, the drug trip, the experience was violent, it was rough, and it wasn't as if he was slowly getting submerged in water. It was a storm, hard rain. And you can clearly see that in the trip. In the first volume, we can see Kabu was even drowning at one point, right? So why was it violent? I think it's because Ultra Heaven is a shortcut to opening one's awareness to ascension. He didn't slowly enter the sea of consciousness, he was thrown into it, against his will even. Another reason is that Kabu's own mind is fucked up, and Ultra Heaven is supposed to show what's in your mind, and it's fucked up for Kabu. You get it. Now, Kabu doesn't even remember that he said that about the rain. He is just zoning out, and Sally is pretty concerned. She says that he's been acting weird, and Kabu says that she's a great cook. Turns out, Kabu was the one who cooked it, not Sally. Kabu starts to remember that he did cook it, and the food flies into his face, only to be interrupted by the bird clock. And then Kabu grabs the spaghetti, and we see his hand morph into this thing just like in volume 1, and the spaghetti engulfs his hand, as well as his face. Then we get a glimpse of a storm in a city. We arrive at the sink as Kabu puts some water on his head. He asks Sally what happened, and it turns out that she can also see the flying spaghetti. From her perspective, he just jumped out of nowhere to the sink with the spaghetti on his hand. The scene ends with Sally questioning if the spaghetti was really flying or was it a mass hallucination. So let's go over a few points here. The first point is the timeline. It's clearly not a linear timeline. We're jumping all over the place, just like the rest of the manga. And as Kabu says, it's most likely that this is a flashback, a dream, just like we've talked about before. And the second point is the flying spaghetti. Remember, spaghetti, Kabu's past with his mom, right? The spaghetti engulfs Kabu, just like in the shower. And guess what? He actually does have a shower on the sink, He gets covered with water. And that shower brings him to the reigning city. I mentioned before how Kabu is inside the sea of consciousness, right? And because of that, he's brought back to his mother, his past, shown by the spaghetti. But what I haven't told you is that after he's brought back to the past, He's supposed to be this enlightened person who's aware of himself. Figuratively, as in knowing yourself, your past, and literally, as in realizing that he's in the hygiene department this whole time. That's what I think the Rainy City represents, his subconscious trying to wake himself up. It's the same as in Volume 1. That's why later on we see the two agents in that city. Every time we see the hygiene boys, this is what's happening. The third point is that Kabu actually made the spaghetti fly because we know Sally can see it. I say that this is a confirmation of Kabu's powers. It's not all in his head, and it'll be more relevant after this. Moving on, Sally asks Kabu if he threw up using the amplifier. Kabu says yes. Sally asks if he only tried it once. Kabu again says yes. Sally then turns on the TV, and we are met with the members of the meditation center on the TV, with the founder Kiriyama Yasuhiro, who is clearly a reference to Shoko Asahara, the leader of the doomsday cult, Aum Shinrikyo, that carried out the 1995 sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway. The cult was a new religion that started off as a yoga and meditation class back in 1987. So it's pretty much a meditation center, and it's also mentioned by Sally that Kiriyama is very educated, just like the members of the Aum Shinrikyo. The systems in the cult were also referenced. The Aum had a ranking system based on the consciousness level of its members. Here's a quote from Ian Reader's book on the Aum Shinrikyo. Aum had developed a highly structured and intensely hierarchical ranking system which related to this belief that there were various levels of existence and of consciousness, and that success at different levels of ascetic practice enabled the practitioner to enter these different realms. Members challenged these various stages in their practice, and success could lead to promotions on Aum's hierarchic spiritual ladder. The system is quite similar to the ones we see later on with the levels in the amplifier, where Sally and Kabu would challenge the levels, as well as the spiritual leaders from the meditation center in the third volume, in the drone. And talking about the amplifier, I think it was inspired by Aum's own Perfect Salvation Unit, or PSI, that they wore on their head. It has the function of sending the guru's thought patterns to the user, the guru being Asahara himself. They believe that doing so will let them attain a higher level of consciousness, and that's not the only thing they did. They also used drugs like LSD to do this. So I think there is clearly a reference made here. However, if we're looking at the beliefs of Aum, they are more similar to Kabu's own beliefs rather than the meditation centers. The Aum had a strong hatred of materialism, just like Kabu, probably because of the 80s bubble economy in Japan, as well as the wealthy capitalist West. Kabu and Aum both renounced the material world, but the Aum chose to chase spiritual enlightenment in very inappropriate ways, whereas Kabu chooses to indulge himself in substances. Is there a bigger meaning behind this reference? I think so, but I'll talk about it in a separate video after the 3 volumes. Or maybe I'll talk about it in volume 3, I don't know. Now, in the meditation center's interview, Kiriyama is explaining a concept in quantum physics based on the measurement problem. Let me explain it, okay? In quantum mechanics, particles exist as several mathematical possibilities described as a wave function rather than one actual object. So it could be there, it could be here, it could be there. Anyway, we don't know until we observe it. When the particle is observed, it is reduced to one actual thing. And the problem is that there's something missing that happens between the particle being a wave of probability or wave function where it could be anywhere and it collapsing into a single particle. There must be a mechanism, but we don't know what that is. We don't know how the wave function collapses, and what we're supposed to do is find the answer. And what we're supposed to do to find the answer is to observe the interaction between the wave and a particle that has already collapsed. So we use like a normal particle, and then we see what happens to the wave function with a measurement device to measure the particles. But this still doesn't make sense, because to truly understand how the wave function becomes a single particle, we have to know how the particle we use to measure the wave collapsed in the first place. So we have to measure the measuring particle again and again in an endless loop of measuring the measurer, because there's always going to be another new measurer. This is called the von Neumann chain, and it is argued that to break this chain, we need something outside the material system of particles that is not bound by any physical laws. And that something is consciousness. Now, this is not a definite conclusion. That's why it's called the measurement problem. It's a problem. But this has led to a lot of the mystic side of quantum mechanics. Yeah, it has led to a lot of people to believe that consciousness can directly affect reality. And that's where our guy Kiriyama comes in. He starts off by saying that reality is a virtual construct from our brains. He shows a spoon to represent matter. Matter is a form of energy. World is an ocean of energy. Matter and space are infinite waves. Talking about the probability wave, the wave function. And our consciousness is at the surface, and the brain perceives these waves. He's talking about the observer effect that we talked about before. You got to observe a particle to collapse the wave. He even mentions the destruction of the quantized wave function. And then we get into the pseudoscience. Where do these waves come from? Kiriyama likens it to the tides in the sea, that a wave symbolizes the sea, and by looking at the waves, you can understand the universe, which is still plausible. But then they talk about a higher order being and how we can observe and tamper with that higher order by controlling our consciousness on top of the wave. It's where information flows, considering our consciousness is at the end of the von Neumann chain, and we can reverse that flow to affect matter directly. He's basically saying that we can use our minds to change matter, and this dude bends the spoon for real. Hey man, I don't know what's happening. It's pretty confusing. Anyway, I actually do not like quantum physics. I think it's a waste of time. Just being honest. Anyway, my guy bends the spoon, right? And he uses a spoon to illustrate this. And I don't know why, but spoon bending is like the number one stereotype for espers, psychic powers, in manga and otaku culture, whatever. I think it has something to do with the Matrix, but I've also seen some pre-Matrix spoon bending in Japan from the 80s. So yeah, I thought that was a little interesting, but really I just want to bring up the Matrix because the scene of Kiriyama bending the spoon has the same point for Kabu as it did for Neo in the Matrix when he met the little bald spoon bender. The kid says, "There is no spoon. It is not the spoon that bends. It is only yourself." Kabu needs to shed off his preconceived notions of reality and realize that his psychic powers are out of control and understand that the mind can control reality. There's a nice little touch to illustrate this in the manga. There are numerous panels of Kabu giving off a serious look. The best one is when Kabu and Kiriyama are both looking at Soga, the other guy, with the amp. It's like they both know what he's going through. And then Sally talks about how guys like Soga can't see the border between dreams and reality. And Kabu's like, "Oh, that's me." She says that Soga would have been exposed as a fake because he was struggling to get a hold of himself. I think this speaks to Kabu's own potential shown in the drome or later on. He ascends to an even higher place than Soga, showing that Kabu really does have that potential. Sally says, "The gifted advance real quick into a higher state. They grow powerful without noticing it, and soon they can control their power anymore." What does this really mean for Kabu? Why does he have higher potential than everyone else? And that's where Mr. Walleye appears to remind us that Kabu has the aura of a diseased man. He sees through the meaninglessness of life, that it might as well be an illusion, a dream, and he wants to find something beyond that. Guys like Sogo aren't there yet. There's still attachment, there's still pride. You see Kabu in the third volume provoking Soga by calling him names, and it works. Vice versa though, when Soga calls Kabu names, it doesn't work. Kabu doesn't care. Anyway, back to the apartment. Kabu asks Sally about his aura, and she goes on to get the amp. You can see Sally giving Kabu concerned looks as well. She knows that we're gonna ascend. After Sally leaves, Kabu decides to sit on the couch and try out meditating, pretty much, keeping in mind that consciousness can affect reality. And he starts to imagine. We get glimpses of a clock, spaghetti, a spoon, and a brain. The clock relates to the idea of dreams, how Kabu is in one right now. The fact that he's meditating, which is, supposed to be like going to sleep. But the bird alarm turns on, like he's just waking up, adding to the ambiguity, waking up and sleeping at the same time. The spaghetti symbolizes his past, not just his past with his mother, but what happened a few minutes ago with the dancing spaghetti. The spoon alludes to the new ideas Kabu has after watching the clip of the meditation center. Imagination, the brain is the universe, right? And lastly, we have the brain, Kabu's brain, and the neurons inside of it. Everything here is happening in his brain, and we get the one panel of a neuron lighting up, like a light bulb moment or something. Pretty straightforward, and then bam, the bird alarm activates. Kabu wakes up and he walks to the kitchen to find himself and Sally in the scene before with the flying spaghetti. He stares emotionlessly and saves himself from getting consumed by the spaghetti. Takes himself to the sink and douses himself in water. One thing to look at is Kabu's expression. He's smiling. What does this mean? I think Kabu just tapped into his subconscious, the same subconscious from volume 1 that's telling Kabu to wake up. Wake up is a dream. And then that's why he brings himself to the sink, to wake himself up with water. And again, water symbolizes a baptism, purity, right? Washing away the filth, and that filth being the illusion, and also sea of consciousness. That's why the city that Kabu arrives at is raining heavily, right? Raining city, like before. Kabu is standing in the rain looking at his hands, and again, I want you to look at his expression in this panel. He has a little smirk, and I think it's because Kabu's subconscious has fused with his dreaming self. They are now one. As a result, he realizes that this is a dream and he's in the hygiene department. I think this is why there's a lot of lightning here. It's a shock to him. The storm symbolizes the storm in his heart. And then you can see his smirk disappear into a frown. His eyes turn emotionless when the hygiene department duo arrives. It's almost as if he knows that he's powerless against them. Either way, they shoot Kabu in the head and we arrive at the hygiene department. It's the scene before it, right? Kabu has flatlined. He's entered the imminent death phase. He's almost dead, just like in the end of the first volume. It seems that the closer he is to death, the more powerful he becomes. The hygiene boys say that he's reprocessing memory, blah blah blah, and that to save Kabu's self-awareness, they're going to inject metallium inside of him. Now, I was mistaken in the first volume. Metallium isn't just some made-up substance. It's a reference to Ultra 7. Yeah, the character 7 was based on. It's a reference to Ultra 7's weapon, the metallium beam, or in Japanese it's like metallium beam. In fact, Ultraman is such an important reference in this manga that I might just make a separate video for it, But I will of course discuss it later on in the analysis, but not now, because I can't explain it without going into the later scenes in Volume 3 in heavy detail. So for now, we're going back to this scene. We move on to Kabu flying over the bubbles again, looking at the hygiene boys. And he works his way back to the flashback reality in the bubbles, until eventually he wakes up. the exact reverse order of what happened before. Pretty cool. Now I want to talk about the hygiene department because this is their last appearance. They don't show up in the third volume, only the agents themselves. Personally, I think that Kabu being locked up here happens after all that stuff in the drum. They lock him up after fucking up the drum for experimentation, which fits perfectly with the flashback theory. They'll definitely show up in the fourth volume, if there is a fourth volume. But yeah, Kabu is woken up by the bird alarm. He's shaking, laughing. He looks at the clean table, which he didn't remember cleaning, and bumps his head on the door frame. Kabu's going crazy. Sally walks in and they have a conversation about Ultra Heaven, how it has the same effects as an amplifier. Memory loss, confusion between dreams and reality. Kabu also mentions Mr. Scarf's friend who died. And then Sally teases Kabu by telling him reality is a dream. Nothing is real. And eventually she gives Kabu the amplifier. And as Kabu is wearing the amp, we are shown a band-aid on his forehead from the bump on the door, alluding to his third eye being closed, I think. Or maybe it's a homunculus reference, with the drilling in the head. After that, Sally has a tsundere moment, whatever. They do some belly breathing, and then the trip finally begins. The trip starts off with this amazing spread. My goodness. Imagine how good this looks in a real physical copy. Anyway, Kabu mentions that a pump called radon feels just like it. Then on the next page, we see these different versions of Sally turning into a spiral, and from the other end, Kabu comes out. I think the spiral shows the fusion between Sally and Kabu as they use the amplifier. Next, Sally mentions something about a magnetic field, and apparently Kabu is used to this sensation as it feels similar to, another drug that he has tried. And then Sally mentions that they are currently in calibration, where the amplifier synchronizes the two users with each other. The symbol of the inner world is then shown, or what I like to call consciousness. The amp translates the representations of the brain's activity into this thing that will continue to show up till the third volume. I think it's the same thing that shows up right in the beginning of volume 1, that weird thing in the commercial. But anyway, Kabu and Sally then synchronize successfully in this amazing page, and the thing to look at is the fact that there are 3 pupils, a combination between Kabu and Sally's eyes, and the one in the middle is the third eye. We'll see it again later. Now, they are both able to look from each other's perspective. Again, another groundbreaking panel layout. Sally then increases the level, and she mentions that the feelings of the 2 people wearing the amp are shared. Then, a mention of magnetic glittering. I don't know what that is, honestly. And eddy currents, which, as an electrical engineering student, I can tell you that it isn't important enough to explain. She's just explaining what the amp does, I guess. There's some mention of vomiting, waves. She says that we'll be drowned in emotions, and by mastering them, we can open the key to the gate of awareness. I guess the waves might represent the quantum waves that were mentioned before. Then the third eye makes another appearance, and there's some really nice imagery where the third eye sheds a single tear that causes the waves in the last page, implying that by going through the waves, you can find the source of enlightenment, which is the third eye. Pretty cool. Next, we have a voice telling us, don't let anything tie you down. Stay free. You have another self always there looking at you. Which is, the conclusion of the second volume, actually. This voice is probably Kabu's own subconscious. We'll get to what it means at the end of the volume. Now, this third eye we were talking about before slowly turns into a spiral by the next page, and it ends with Sally telling Kabu that he's lost in it. I think that for a moment, Kabu was deep inside of his own mind, and that's why he hears his subconscious. After Kabu snaps out of it, we see the world being alive. Everything is reborn every second. I guess this is what Kiriyama said before, that the world is a series of vibrations. Sally then explains that they are in level 2, where the brain's information processing stops and they are like newborn children in the world of quantum oscillation, the energy ocean under the waves. Kiriyama mentioned that by finding the source of the waves, we arrive at a higher level, which is what this place is. There's one thing I want to highlight, this DMT pupil right here, which is the same one we see in Volume 1. Does this mean that the hallucinations caused by Ultra Heaven takes place in level 2 in the amp? I don't think so. I think the hallucinations take place in multiple levels. It jumps around from level to level. Now, I think this pupil with hexagons allows Kabu to see the infinite possibilities of the world, since in the next page and in Volume 1, we see multiple eyes, Kabu's and Sally's. There's a lot of them. Sally herself even explains this. And then she explains that we are going deeper into the ocean. They're entering level 3. Now in level 3 and 4, we are presented with Kabu's memories with his mother, which is the most important part in this volume. Also the most dense, I think. Okay, level 3 starts off with a void of white light or the magnetic glittering, and suddenly there are some cans falling from the void. We get a glimpse of Kabu's mother. A key detail here is her beauty mark right under her lip. She calls Kabu as the cans fall to the ground. The sound effects here and the visuals tell us that this was loud. It wasn't just rolling off the shelves. They fell hard. Then we see Kabu on top of the scattered cans, but his mom tells him to get a move on and follow her, leaving the cans behind. We then see Kabu's inner thoughts. But are we leaving them like this? Say, Mom? Kabu is confused. Turns out, his mom went ahead, and as Kabu tries to catch up, the only thing he sees are mirages of unidentifiable phantoms, basically strangers. Then, in the next page, Kabu looks up at the mall. The panel with the eyes, Kabu's eyes, showing his glittering wonder. Kabu's mom pulls him away to the sitting escalator, or whatever it is, and they take a seat. Kabu turns to his mom to find out that she has no beauty mark, which means it's not his mom. Or is it? Next, we are shown Kabu and his new mom sitting on a couch with him thinking, does she get to be my new mom? And Kabu not wanting her. We then see Sally in the position of the new mom on the couch, commenting, so that's how you built your psyche. A born vagrant, a seed without any land to plant itself in. Her numerous judging eyes staring deep into Kabu's soul. Kabu feels suffocated, and he is also literally suffocating in the clouds, crawling in pain. The clouds then turn into a bunch of cans, and Sally exclaims that they are at level 3, where proto-experiences are brought back. Proto meaning first, so basically his earliest memories. Kabu then says that this was a dream he had when he was a boy. Sally says that it's not a dream. He's there right now because, they're in a dream. Kabu turns back into a boy, and his mother, or whoever it is, takes out some patches or pumps, sticks it on her hand, and says, we're all going to heaven. We get lots of imagery of people having fun. Kabu asks her, what's heaven? She says, a land of brightness where everything is possible. But then Kabu says that he doesn't want to go, and she responds, just stay here. We black out, and the speech bubbles say her heart, overdose, the boy still sleeping, the boy being Kabu. Then Kabu asks the guys who they are. They explain that they are from the Bureau of Hygiene. Kabu asks where his mom is, and they answer she's gone far away. Kabu asks to heaven? They answer, that's right. to heaven. At the last panel, his left lens cracks, and the whole image cracks into pieces as we are transported back to the apartment. So let me stop right there because there's a lot to unpack here. Stay with me, okay? First of all, the cans at the beginning fell off because of Kabu. Probably. It was implied that he did it. His mother tells him to get a move on and just leave the cans behind. She doesn't even care about it. This makes Kabu confused, and that is the key point. Why is he confused? It's because his mom doesn't usually act like this. I mean, children are dumb, I guess, but if there's one thing they're good at, it's picking up their parents' behavior. And I think that makes perfect sense. So then the next question should be, why is Kabu's mom acting differently? It's because she's taking drugs, pumps. We know this because there was a mention of an overdose by the hygiene officers. His mom overdosed and died. So going back to this scene, we can take it in two ways. One, she's acting weird because she's taking drugs. And two, his mom leaving Kabu alone in a sea of strangers is because she died. She left Kabu figuratively and literally, I guess. In the next page, Kabu gets pulled away by this woman who we know isn't his mother since there is no beauty mark. Or is it? I actually think this is his mother, but then where's the beauty mark? In the beginning she has one, and then now she doesn't. Well, it's because she's acting weird. Because of the drugs, Kabu doesn't see this woman as his mother anymore. So much so that the dream transitions to the other mothers that Kabu has had in his life. In the very next page, we see him thinking, does she get to be my new mom? Which implies that Kabu was an orphan getting adopted and whatnot. A born vagrant, the face of the foster mother obscured just like the strangers from before. Kabu doesn't remember their faces. The clouds that suffocate Kabu represent heaven, the place his mom is supposedly living at, as we'll see later, and it also shows how Kabu felt back then and right now, suffocated. Revisiting your past is a hard thing to do, especially if you have a shitty childhood, and Sally here is looking into his soul, literally, as it is exposed for her and himself to see. And I think another thing is the clarity in which these visions are presented. The shining, calm eyes maybe represents Kabu's subconscious forcing himself to look at his past. And his subconscious is obviously on like a higher level since it is in the future again. He's actually in the future. This is a flashback. The clouds that were suffocating Kabu turns into the cans from before, indicating how traumatic that experience was. The guilt of leaving the cans behind and the alienating behavior of his mother. It might not seem like much, but as a child, it's those weird moments that stick with you. But anyway, then Sally says we're at level 3, where we see the proto or earliest memories we possess. Kabu actually confirms this by saying that it's a dream from when he's a boy. And Sally says, it ain't just a dream, we're there right now. And there's an interesting thing that happens here. In the background, Sally morphs into Kabu's mom. And I think this ties into the fact that Sally is sort of a replacement for Kabu's mother as a caring figure in his life. Someone to support him, showing him that he's not alone. But we'll get to that near the end. I just wanted to plant that idea in your brain. So, going back here, Kabu turns back into a child sitting beside his mother on the escalator thing and asks his mother a question. Where are we going? She answers to heaven as she puts a patch on her wrist. One thing to note again is Kabu looking at her chin that lacks a beauty mark. He doesn't recognize her as his mother. So, after she uses the patch, suddenly the escalator turns into a roller coaster that descends from the skies, where everyone is using the patch as well. Their faces filled with ecstasy as they scream, to heaven, to heaven. So, what is heaven? What does it mean exactly? Now, to explain this, I'm going to assume that Volume 3 does not exist. So we're going to look at what heaven means in the context of Volume 2 specifically. First of all, it has to do with the legalization of drugs. Kabu's childhood occurred during the peak of that movement, where everyone was using pumps. Every day felt like a party. Basically, drugs felt like heaven, and Kabu's mother is one of those people who were using the drugs. She then explains to Kabu in the next page after he asks what is heaven. She answers, a land of brightness where everything is possible, which shows the hope people had after the legalization of drugs. That hope for the future, everything's gonna change, anything is possible. There's this euphoria you get, kind of like when you're taking drugs. But also like when you're taking drugs, shit goes down hard, because Kabu's mom eventually dies from an overdose. But let's get back here for a second. Kabu, still on the roller coaster, tells his mom that he doesn't want to go to heaven, and she tells him that he can just stay here. Why doesn't he want to go though? Well, it's because of his mother's alienating change in behavior after taking the drugs. But also, the second meaning of this scene has to do with his mother's death. The scene right after, where we wake up in Kabu's point of view, the two hygiene officers inform him of his mother's death. But they didn't say she died, they said that she went to heaven. So heaven here takes on two meanings, a land of brightness, of happiness, which is what heaven should be, and on the other hand, it also means death, heaven as in the afterlife. And that's why Kabu seeks death. He wants to go to heaven with his mother, and just like her, he keeps taking drugs to reach that heaven. So moving on, the trip ends with a crack on the hygiene officer's glasses. Just like in Volume 1, the hygiene guys, their glasses get cracked. I don't know why though, maybe the eye represents something, maybe they're the bringer of bad news for Kabu, every time they appear, something goes wrong for him. I don't know. Either way, it transitions back to Sally's eye, and Kabu beside her asks her, which level are we on now? Sally explains that they shouldn't go deeper. There's a wall, it will only bring pain, but Kabu's like, nah, we need to go deeper. And then we get the sick people need to make sure of their own sickness reference from the beginning. And now we enter the scene of Kabu seeing his dead mother. I'm guessing that because this scene takes place in a higher level of consciousness, this memory of Kabu seeing the dead body of his mother must have been a repressed memory. Like Kabu had forgotten it because the trauma was, too overwhelming. It's usually called dissociation. Anyway, Kabu's led by the hand of the hygiene officer to see his mother. They open the sheets to show her face, and Kabu responds by saying that you're not in heaven at all, a liar. He thinks that she's sleeping. He touches her cold, lifeless face, unable to comprehend what happened to her. The woman, crying, mutters, she looks like she's only sleeping. As in the next page, the scene fades out with that phrase being echoed, looks like she's only sleeping. And that is the key. Subconsciously, a part of Kabu thinks that his mother is still alive. I mean, he knows that she's dead, but I think deep down his inner child is still confused, still can't believe that she's dead. And thus, Kabu is unable to accept or move on from his mother's death, right? I wouldn't even call it denial, because as a child, the situation was very confusing for Kabu. She's taking drugs, says that she's going to heaven, and then later people say that she did go to heaven, only to find her sleeping? But she's not sleeping. Her body is cold to touch, the people around her are crying. Is she dead? It's very confusing for him, and I think that creates this trauma that is just so massive for Kabu that it affects his whole life even though he forgot about it. And as we move on, it gets even worse. Sally snaps back to the apartment to realize that they're going deep in the 4th level. Her aura is gleaming and she feels that Kabu's going far, far away. Death, basically. And she turns to see Kabu tripping. His aura is going nuts. Sally's forced back into the trip, and we see Kabu touching his mother's face, his eyes in disbelief. I mean, his eyes are just piercing. It's actually kind of scary, you know. And then in the next page, we're in the mountains. Kabu's mother is buried in the mountains as they drift off into the sky as if to ascend. Sally screams in horror, just like the hippie did with Mr. Walleye in Volume 1. This is a forced ascension. A few things here. First, we now learn that the body is frozen, not wet with water. And, frozen cold, just like Kabu's mother. It means that every time we see this frozen body, it means death. But then why is Kabu's mom buried, whereas Sally and Kabu are drifting into the sky? I think it's because Sally and Kabu are ascending, no pun intended. Ascending to an even higher dimension, kind of, whereas Kabu's mom is supposedly, she's not dead yet. See, you gotta remember that this is all happening in Kabu's mind, and as I said, he doesn't think that his mother is truly dead, which is why she's buried in the mountains. To me, it's like an intermediate state or place between life, death, and a higher dimension. That's why she's there and Kabu's leaving her, and I think he's not leaving her. He's not exactly going to a higher realm. I think he's just going to be dead because Kabu hasn't gotten over his past yet. Unlike in the third volume when, Kabu kinda has gone over his past and he becomes this being of light, almost, skipping his death. But now he's just dead. At least I think so. I'm not really sure about this one, but yeah. So Sally screams and Kabu falls over to the floor. Kabu's brain dead, flatlining, and Sally panics until eventually she musters up her will to save Kabu. It's a great scene, really shows Sally's great character. I do want to highlight one thing. In one of the panels after Sally takes Alice and goes after Kabu, we see a spiral on her forehead, third eye or whatever, which is exactly the same as Kabu in the first volume during his trip, when he was over the bridge and there's this plane flying by. And to me, this means that Ultra Heaven's trip, the deepest levels of the trip, is equivalent to level 4 in the Amplifier. This is actually related to Buddhism, specifically the concept of bardo, which is the intermediate state between death and rebirth. I think the trip with Ultra Heaven, the Amplifier, even in the Drome, when it all goes crazy, it all takes place in the bardo. And if you look at Tibetan Buddhism, they believe that there are 6 levels to the bardo, the 4th being the bardo of death, where we experience a clear light, just like we see in the beginning of level 3 in the Amplifier. And then there's the 5th bardo, where we experience dream or trance-like visions based on our karmas, which is pretty much what's happening here to Kabu. So the trips are a mix of the 4th and the 5th bardo. In Volume 3, this will have a lot more significance. But yeah, I just want to tell you, I thought it was interesting. Anyway, Sally goes after Kabu, she's back in the mountains, and we transition into Kabu's past through the TV. And if before we looked at Kabu's trauma, now we look at the good in Kabu's past, the memory of his mother's cooking. So we look at this scene through Sally's perspective. We see Kabu cooking the Napolitan spaghetti with the special recipe given by his mother. The details of the dish, the ingredients, the smell, it shows how important this is to Kabu. It's his core memory of his mother, the one moment that defines his mother's warmth. And she's a single mother, they live in a small apartment. It's the only recipe she knows. They didn't have an easy life. And through this scene, through their struggle, you really feel Kabu's love for his mother. It's truly a heartbreaking scene because it's the last source of warmth in Kabu's life. And as an orphan, he's desperately clinging on to it with no one else to support him. That's why Kabu's the one who's cooking the spaghetti. In the next scene, we see Sally coming into the apartment with the vegetables for the salad, which is also a dish by Kabu's mom. While she's walking in, we see a child version of Kabu trying to cook the spaghetti. This shows that internally, Kabu is still a child who's trying to handle the loss of his mother all alone. And of course, he can't do that. That's why he spills the spaghetti. And the other thing is Sally walking in, crashing into herself, and dissolving into these beads of water. It shows Kabu's rejection of any outside help or influence. As Sally is walking in, she's suggesting a new recipe for the salad, obviously different with the recipe from Kabu's mother. Kabu rejects this because he's still clinging on, afraid of moving on from his past, replacing the recipe of the salad from his mother. But here's the thing, if you look at the content of the bubbles themselves, they're filled with the times Sally supported Kabu, when she showed her care for him, and also when he hugged her. This shows that deep down in Kabu's subconscious, he feels Sally's care for him and he actually wants to accept it. But he's not ready to do so just yet. We are now back at the apartment with Kabu offering to cook leftovers for Sally, with Sally herself realizing that this is a dream. Then Kabu mentions that instead, they can start all over again with images of Kabu spilling the spaghetti in between. Again, referring to Kabu moving on from his past, starting all over again, or just keep tying himself down to the leftovers from his past. He then mentions that he had a dream about preparing the Napolitan as a child and spilling it. Deep down, he realizes that clinging on to the past will ultimately destroy him. And in the middle of thinking, the spaghetti on the table falls to the floor. Kabu grabs his head in shock. Sally tries to reach for Kabu, but he rejects her, screaming, "Don't touch me," as her hand phases through him and everything flies to the sink. Kabu suddenly wonders what he's doing and gets back to dishwashing. I think this shows the cycle of suffering Kabu is in. Deep down, he knows that the correct thing to do is to start all over again and move on from his past. But to do that, he must first face it. He gotta look at his past, understand it, which involves a lot of pain, right? It might be a reach, but I think that's what the falling spaghetti means. The reason Kabu is clutching his head is because he rejects the idea of moving on. It's too painful, his mind is in conflict, it's like a paradox. You want to move on, but if you move on, it hurts, and then you don't want to move on, but if you don't move on, it also hurts, so, what the hell? And when Sally reaches out to help him, again, that's outside influence, Kabu doesn't want that because he thinks that's going to make him forget the past. His mind rejects that completely, and finally he reverts back to his usual self, resetting, and the cycle of suffering continues. It can only end in death. And since we're in Kabu's mind, the cycle is embodied into an actual dream, a dream on the verge of death. Sally realizes this and tries to wake Kabu up and escape from this dream, figuratively and literally. But Kabu is in a trance. Heaven, we're going to heaven. It's not a dream, it's a flashback, it's an illusion. While the sink spews out a spaghetti pillar to heaven. First of all, the sink represents the void in his soul, the hole that Mr. Wall and Kabu were talking about back at the lake. That hole is caused by Kabu not accepting and facing his past. He tries to fill this hole, or in this case sink, with his warped version of the past that focuses on the negative. The fact that his mother is a junkie who overdosed to death, and heaven in this case becomes something negative. He associates it with the time they were on the escalator in the mall when his mom was acting so weird, with no beauty mark. So instead of his mother, that was caring, that always made him his favorite spaghetti, Kabu focuses on this warped version so much that he gets consumed by it. He reaches into the spaghetti pillar and gets devoured. Now, Sally actually tries to give Kabu the answer. Whatever you think, you end up seeing it. It's possible to move on from past. You just gotta look at it differently. It's all in your mind. But, it doesn't work. He just ends up in the spaghetti. Now Sally tries to hug Kabu, but he dissolves into water, and now she's in the park again. It's the other way around. She's the one hugging Kabu. But then a mark on the tree appears for Sally to come along. And I think this mark was left by Kabu's subconscious, because really, deep down, Kabu wants to be saved. Sally puts her hand on the tree as she thinks, your gateway to heaven. And we transition into Kabu touching his mother's face. And yes, his gateway to heaven is getting over his mother's death. In the next page, Kabu's mom starts to freeze up, and the frost travels up Kabu's arm and eventually fills up the whole room. Again, being frozen means death. At first, Kabu thinks his gateway to heaven is death. That's why he's also getting frozen. But Sally's there to remind him that he shouldn't let it tie him down. The world is reborn every second. We can start all over again. You can cook spaghetti on her own now. And actually, you can see the representation of Kabu's mind gleaming with light, kind of showing that he's changing his mind. And also, the reason that Kabu can cook spaghetti on his own, can stand on his own, is because Sally is there to support him. That's actually why the spaghetti consumes her. Kabu finally accepts Sally. We're back with Kabu's mother, and she's awake, offering to make him some pasta. But Kabu lets go of her face and tells her he can do it on his own. Someone taught him, and next time he'll cook for her. Kabu tells her good night and sheds a single tear. He has finally accepted her death. The scene fades into Sally putting Kabu's head over the sink. It turns out Sally was the one who shed a single tear. Kabu is crying, bawling, along with the water from the sink, washing away the spaghetti, washing away his dependence on the past. It's almost like a baptism. Actually, it is a baptism. And remember, water represents the passageway between two realms of consciousness. That's what's happening here. He's waking up, backtracking through the levels, from level 4 to 1 to waking up. And I also want to point out that previously, it was Kabu himself putting his head over the sink, his subconscious. He was still depending on himself. But now Sally's there to fill that role, to wake Kabu up. He's finally accepted her, and the spaghetti gets washed down the sink, filling that hole inside of Kabu. The emptiness in his soul is now filled with the memory of his mother, shown by the spaghetti going into the sink. And since the hole is filled, the gate to awareness is now open. Enlightenment. The next page starts with Kabu waking up from this dream, the clock. Then it's filled with the times people supported Kabu, the people that resuscitated Kabu in the bar, the bartender wishing him a long life. Kabu learns to accept that love and warmth from other people, the value of human connection. Then a monologue starts, telling him to not be tied down, be free, and that you have another self looking at you. Then we see the sun rise above the mountains, and then the earth, which I think refers to the idea of everything being connected. That is the ultimate revelation that will take you above these mountains. The other self that's looking at you is every other person on this planet. Or is it? Turns out, after this, we get a monologue from Kiriyama, the founder of the meditation center, where he exclaims that you just stepped onto the path of evolution. This is just the first step to enlightenment. We're actually not there yet. That's what Volume 3 is for, as well as Volume 4. If that ever happens. Kiriyama continues telling us that to attain a higher state, they should go to the meditation center, and Volume 2 finally ends. So, in Volume 2, Kabu gets over his past and learns to accept love, which is kind of a funny, it's kind of generic in a way, but it's not generic. So, learns to accept love. But he still lacks a few things, namely a philosophy, a direction, who he is, what defines him as a person. And that's what Volume 3 is all about. At least I think so. I haven't started analyzing it. I'm still very confused. But yeah, that's it for volume 2. There's actually some more stuff about, some Buddhist symbolism in volume 2. But I'm going to separate that into another video. I'm actually planning to make a whole series about like specific topics in Ultra Heaven besides the main 3 volume analysis. Or 4, I hope volume 4 comes out. And lastly, I want to give a huge shout out to Gant's Waiting Room, the scanlation team who worked on Ultra Heaven. If any of you guys are watching, thank you very much for scanlating it. I'm sorry if my video sucked though, at least presentation wise. So yeah, thanks for watching.